All right, let's kick things off. So welcome to the very first of what I hope is a very fruitful and valuable series of conversations and discussions, the first edition of the CNX Forum. Now, there are a ton of resources out there for developers and cloud architects around cloud native technologies and many others. And while I do definitely hope that these conversations are useful and interesting for that community, the primary audience for this is really the buyers and the consumers of these technologies, product owners, data center managers, executive leaders, people that may be looking into this area possibly for the first time in order to address a specific business need or set of business needs. And the reason that we chose the topic for this session, asking the question, what is cloud native, is because in attempting to answer that question, we end up really talking about just about every topic that's relevant in IT. It's such a broad topic, and that's something I think we're going to get into as well today. But we'll talk about things like cybersecurity and data, AI, data privacy, you name it. Now, while we'll end up touching on a lot of these topics, we're probably not going to be able to get into the sort of depth that many of these topics deserve. And that also gives us a really great opportunity because this will tee up follow-up CNX Forum sessions where we can pick a specific area like security or AI and just do a deep dive on a session just on that topic. So I really think this is a great setup for further sessions. Really look forward to getting feedback as well on things that would be interesting to hear about in the future. So on that topic, let me move on to some introductions and introduce myself and the panelists here with me today. So my name is Lee Razo. I'm the CEO and chief technologist, that's a mouthful, for CloudNativeX. And I'll talk a little bit more shortly about what we're doing at CloudNativeX. But I also want to introduce with me today Patrick van Helden. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Xcellerate Labs. And Xcellerate works with a portfolio, quite a large portfolio now, of early stage cloud native technology innovators. Patrick works with them on their strategy, product strategy, technical strategy, even their go-to-market strategy. So he's got a really current view on a lot of the companies creating the sorts of technologies that we're talking about today. Prior to Xcellerate, he was at Google, where he ended up after the acquisition of his previous company, Elastofile, another cloud native innovator. So Patrick comes with a really unique perspective on this. So welcome, Patrick.
Thanks for having me.
And also with me is Jonathan Wisler, the director of Magnify Consulting. Now, Jonathan was the first employee and the first managing director for Europe for Softlayer, which many might remember. That's one of the pioneers in this cloud computing space. Jonathan led Softlayer through a period of hypergrowth, which helped lead to their acquisition by IBM a few years ago, where Jonathan also spent a few years working with their largest customers on basically on their own cloud journey. So he's really seen the market from both perspectives, from the startup point of view, the scrappy startup, to the trying to steer the big ship and getting established companies to change their strategy. So welcome, Jonathan.
Oh, thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me. This is a great subject. So glad to dive in.
Yep. And of course, we'll talk later, but I forgot to mention as well that most recently you were the CEO of Sensotera, which is an IoT innovator, and we're going to talk about that later as well. So.
Excellent. Yep.
Great. So let's get right into it. The topic of today, what is cloud native? So, if I take that term cloud native literally, what it suggests to me is any technology that was created from the beginning in the cloud. To me personally, it suggests the public cloud, in fact. So when I hear that term, I think public cloud, and I think the technology was just invented in the cloud. It was never on any on-premise technology to begin with. Now, along comes something called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which also has a definition. And if you ask any technically oriented person, a developer, an architect, they're likely to tell you this definition, which focuses on specific technologies, things like containers and service meshes, declarative APIs. Now, while that's very clear and that's something tangible, strictly speaking, none of those technologies are particularly dedicated to just being in the cloud, nor are they even necessarily new. Now, but what I do think these two definitions have in common is they both, in their own way, refer to taking the full advantage of the sort of elasticity, scalability, and limitlessness of the cloud. This could be software, but also hardware. The cloud is inherently elastic, and any technology that makes the most of this, I think this is probably the most meaningful definition of the word. But I also would like to take a different angle, because I think in some ways, it's a term that's very much now in the moment, but in the long run, we've seen this sort of thing before. So the way I like to look at it is in a different way. If you think about the last 10 or 15 years or so, where all the innovation has occurred, probably most of it you could put in one of these three categories: big data, AI, machine learning, the cloud itself, the public cloud, all the technologies and services around it, and automation and orchestration technologies. And by now, most of the dominant technologies and the big players are kind of well known. So it's not that there isn't any innovation happening here, but it's kind of starting to plateau. It's sort of starting to settle. So where is the next round of innovation going to come from? Well, in my opinion, it's the overlaps. The next round of innovation, all of the things that we talk about now that we call cloud native, you can probably map in one or more of these overlaps. Things like API security, which we'll talk a little bit about as well, or edge computing, or even blockchain. We have things like AI ops, which uses machine learning to optimize resource usage in the cloud. All kinds of areas. They wouldn't be startups if they existed already. So this is where I think the new parts of the technology are coming from. And these are actually the partners that we work with at CloudNativeX. These are the companies that are working in these areas. And I kind of group them into at least what I think the next big three circles are likely to be, or some form of them. At the end of the day, words are just words, but I really think we're starting to see a lot of innovation in these little areas here. And that is actually what CloudNativeX is focused on. Like I said at the beginning, we are aimed primarily at the buyers and consumers of cloud native technology. And we work with many of these companies as well as many others, but our real mission and our goal is to enable buyers and consumers of technologies to do faster and better research. When you're out there trying to understand these technologies, what they do and how they map back to your business needs, that's exactly what we're here to do. So with that, let's jump into the topic itself. What exactly is cloud native? I've kind of given a few ideas of what I think, but I'd actually like to turn it over to Jonathan. What does this term cloud native mean to you, and what's your perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this debate has been going on for some time. When I joined Softlayer, we're an infrastructure as a service provider, and there was a lot of debates internally do we call ourselves a cloud company? Because at that time, Amazon Web Services was just emerging, and they were what you call before really a public cloud. So basically, a multi-tenant shared virtual machine with storage network. We had bare metal, and we had a private cloud, which means it was single tenant, but we provided the virtual machines. So we had all this debate going on internally saying, do we call ourselves a cloud company? And in the end, we said, yeah, we are a cloud company for the reasons that we have an automated delivery model. We give you burstability. It's standardized. So you say, okay, here's the standard scripts, and you write to those, and then you could scale it up and scale it down as you needed. So we saw it more of a delivery model than actually saying, okay, it's a pure technology play. And you mentioned before, when we were acquired by IBM, one of our first visitors to the Softlayer offices was the mainframe team. And, they sat down with the mainframe guys, and they said, look, we have a cloud in a box, essentially. It's standardized. It has network, it has storage. You can burst, you can run simultaneous workloads. It has automatic failover. And we're saying, yeah, all that stuff you can do in the cloud as well, but at a much bigger scale, right? In the mainframe, you'll be constrained to what you can run in that box. In the cloud, it's limitless. Obviously, someone has to plumb these things and make sure they work, and there are physical data centers beside it, but you really get that scalability. And in my mind, that defines it as cloud.
Yeah.
And, where I see it headed, I think, is a lot like electricity. So you flip on the switch, the power comes on. I think it's the same with cloud, where you say, okay, you write some prompts, you send some code, some commands, and then boom, the compute and network and storage, they're just there.
Yeah.
And actually, there's some interesting things happening there. There's a company called Helio out of Switzerland, and that's what they're doing for some 3D applications. It's saying, okay, you hit a command prompt, and then it'll just source it, and they'll find the cloud computing resources somewhere in the world, and then just charge you for that. So it's great. You know, you don't really care. You just run the commands, and then the workload happens.
Yeah, that you touch on like three really important areas. Like one, of course, you mentioned Helio, which seems to be, they found an overlap, right? They found, you know, they're not inventing cloud or any of this stuff, but they're finding the innovation where those things converge, basically.
Yeah, and I like their approach because I've heard about brokerage before where I'm in a broker cloud and find resources that aren't being used, but they're really looking at it from a workload and a services perspective, which is, I think, the right approach.
Yeah.
Because if you just say, okay, I'm going to offer infrastructure, that's too broad. But if you're really focusing on, okay, what's the workload and service I need, that's really how you'll deliver the customer demand.
Yeah, and of course, the other thing you mentioned is, you know, what's old is new and what's new is old again. Like mainframes, a cloud kind of just is another a scalable mainframe, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can see some gray hairs, but I remember my first job, I was working for an investment bank, and indeed we were using a mainframe, and they're still using them today. And you sat down at a dumb terminal, and all the compute and everything was happening in the background, and it was processing, you know, millions and millions of transactions flawlessly.
Yeah.
And then it never went down, it never failed over. And then you'd go sit back to your laptop and be like, oh, crash.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was a robust system.
Yeah, that's great. I like the water analogy as well. You know, once you take it for granted, like every other infrastructure, you know, it's successful once people stop talking about it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great. I'd like to get your perspective, Patrick. How do you see that term cloud native, you know, especially, you know, with all the technologies that you're working with?
Hey, so looking for yet another definition, right? Because it's three people on this panel and we all have a different definition. And that makes sense, right? So really for me, it's like it's services or applications, basically services running on this elastic environment, right? And flexible environment that can quickly adapt to like changing business needs. I think of quickly scaling up or scaling down or scaling out very quickly. And then have the ability to do this anywhere in the world, right? So that basically means a cloud native solution will run in a public cloud or will run or span clouds, right? It doesn't need to be one specific cloud, but I think that's one of the key components, that it needs to run on different types of clouds. I think that's very important, right? It shouldn't matter how it's deployed, it just should run on any type of cloud. And that's where we see a lot of innovation, right? Just look at the rise of, for example, OpenShift, right? OpenShift really provides this true cloud independent way of running like containers, right? Kubernetes containers. And what I've seen is that a lot of people actually prefer this to a cloud vendor managed Kubernetes cluster, like AKS or EKS or GKE even.
Yeah, I like that you actually combined the, when I started this thing, I kind of mentioned three versions of the definition, and I think you managed to package all three of them into one answer, which is really great. You know, it is software technology born in the cloud. It's also technical. There's some technologies back there, but in the end, it all comes down to the elasticity and taking advantage of the limitlessness. So that's really well packaged. You also mentioned multiple clouds, which is an interesting area because, you know, as this cloud computing rises, you have these three powerful suppliers. You know, we think we're breaking vendor lock-in with our on-premise suppliers, and then we just end up in another vendor lock-in. So we talk a lot about multi-cloud, you know, people running in different clouds, although usually it just means you run one thing in one cloud and another thing in another cloud. But you know, I can imagine that's really challenging and it's complex, and to, you know, get all those technologies together. Should somebody actually take that approach and go multi-cloud?
Yeah, go multi. I don't think it's really a question if you go multi-cloud. It just happens to be so, right? I've spoken to a lot of companies who say, yeah, we're not multi-cloud by choice. It just happens because this service runs in AWS, this service runs in Google Cloud or in Azure, or we've acquired certain companies and they have like a cloud infrastructure, so it just happens to them, right? So they're more concerned about sort of balancing it out, right? They're afraid to put all their eggs in one basket, so they're looking to balance workloads between the different clouds. So yeah, really looking for like cost federation, availability, what happens if an entire region goes down, right? Or one crucial component goes down, which could impact services in different regions.
Yeah.
In these cases, it would be great if you could just simply flip a switch and switch over to a different region or to a different cloud provider altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that is the holy grail, but I guess what ends up happening is your data lives in one place. Yeah. So are there technologies that address that?
Well, there are for sure technologies that address it, right? So you see a lot of innovation happening, especially on that multi-cloud,
Mm-hmm.
where you, like I said, you can run it independent of the underlying infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Just think of Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes has been designed to run your application on any type of infrastructure. It doesn't matter, all right? You can easily move from Azure to AWS, for example, without changing anything underneath. Right? You could use the managed platforms. You could use like an OpenShift, a lot type of platform. And then you also have like the data mobility platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I'm working with a company called Wrapup, and they provide this unified, fully managed data platform that spans multiple clouds, right? It doesn't matter where your application runs, the data just simply follows.
Wow.
Right? You can set it up in advance if you're planning to move there, or if you happen to need to move to a different region for whatever reason, it simply pulls the data to that region and makes sure it's available.
Yeah, so I can see the benefit of that, like turning the tables a little bit. Rather than adapting your applications to adapt to all these different clouds, you can actually adapt the cloud to adapt to your application, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Now, thanks very much, Patrick. So let me move on to the next topic. Excuse my technology here. Here we go. So cloud native technologies, the all these different things that we're talking about, the elasticity, the decentralization, it brings a lot of really big benefits, right? I think that taking advantage of the cloud sort of ends up in this self-service capability, which is extremely empowering for a lot of people in an organization. For developers, we have obviously DevOps, which is the combination of developers with operations, which is enabled by this. Of course, DevOps has resulted in a whole bunch of other opses. We have data ops and ML ops and sec ops and DevSec ops, and maybe we can add even more to these things. So I think that's great. Users move to cloud native services like Snowflake or Databricks, but then with the decentralization comes the question is what sort of risks come with that? What are the new vulnerabilities that come about from all this decentralization? People leaving S3 buckets open or forgetting that their Jenkins server, running all their DevOps is just openly accessible on the internet. I guess the question from that is basically what are the security implications that we need to address? And more importantly, if you're talking to a security expert, a CISO, or a veteran who's been doing this for 20 years, what's the new thing that they need to learn and look at now that things are changing?
Yeah, so it's definitely super important, right? The security aspect of this. I think you have it as one of the three major next things, right? The sort of the bubbles you showed in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where a lot of the innovation is happening right at the moment. So just as an example, think of API security, right? Or container security. This is becoming absolutely essential, right? We see more and more applications are accessed over the internet or deployed in like web applications or exposing the APIs to think of open banking, right? They're exposing the APIs to third-party users or consumers of it. So it's no longer enough to have access controls in place and have a firewall that has predefined rules. You really need to think like a hacker, right? You need to discover vulnerabilities and discover flaws in your software code that are often exploited by those hackers. So this really means that your security platform needs to have a way to understand the behavior of the application, right? And that's where AI comes in place, right?
Yeah.
It needs to detect sort of user behavior, right? Detect unusual user behavior, right? To really protect you against these potential breaches, hopefully before they happen.
Yeah. I've heard of, for instance, something like zero trust, which is a kind of become a sort of buzzword, but behind every buzzword, there's a meaning. And, that's the concept that you do not only try to prevent a breach, you actually go in with the mindset that you are already breached and design everything around that. Is that something that you've heard of before?
Yeah, definitely. Zero trust goes, just like I said, zero trust. So even if you are an authenticated user, that doesn't mean that we trust you with everything that's sort of behind our firewall.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I'm curious, have you ever seen that as a barrier with the larger customers that you worked with, like at IBM, these sort of concerns, and how did you address them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, security was the primary block for moving to the cloud and moving workloads to the cloud, and it's still a major concern by customers. But I think, what you're seeing now is in the cloud and, designing and architecting for a zero trust, the security is actually improving, right? So you can automate the security, and it's not just reliant on a physical firewalls that are manually, configured by a user. It's really saying, okay, can we have confidential computing at the application layer? So the application could run in many different locations, but then the application itself is in theory impenetrable. So I think actually it was one of the biggest barriers. And to get over that barrier, the security has actually improved significantly in the last years and continues to improve.
Yeah, that's always the big challenge. In my time in the tech industry, I found that the technology itself is the easy part. It's getting people comfortable and trusting of it. That's the thing that takes a lot of time, right?
Indeed. I mean, so there you have to get the chief security officers. They have to be comfortable with the solution. They have to understand it. They have to understand who owns the encryption keys and do they have full control over that, and it doesn't go to a third-party vendor.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's still a lot of convincing the stakeholders that it works and proving that it works.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the cloud security technology is far superior than some of the on-prem methodologies.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great topic. This is definitely going to be one of those that we go into on in a deeper dive, because it's such a huge topic. We work with CloudNativeX, and I think you, Patrick, as well at Xcellerate, with a lot of companies and addressing a lot of different angles of this. So that'll be a really rich topic. So with all that death and destruction out of the way, I like to move to a little bit more of a positive and maybe aspirational topic. Besides the risks of new technology, there's also a lot of unique and new opportunities. And in particular, one that I would love to touch on is IoT, Internet of Things, and edge computing, which is basically finding ways to run the compute resources closer to the actual sources and to the activity rather than in a centralized data center. I mentioned at the top that Jonathan, his most recent role was a CEO of a company called Sensoterra, which was an IoT company focused in the agriculture space. But I think in that experience, you really came into contact with this industry and have a lot of unique perspectives. Where do you see this area going to?
Yeah, for me, this is really exciting. I think, I've been in technology for a long time. I started this company and we were making these crazy things called banner ads. You might have seen one or two. But this is like the real deal when it comes to technology. Now we're in the industrial internet, so it's impacting agriculture, manufacturing, connected vehicles. So I think this is the next tsunami of technology, and I'm super excited about it. And also, I've been following it for a while and seen it, the classic hype cycle and a lot of talk and a lot of tinkering. But now I'm starting to see some real rollouts at scale. So I think, we're on the edge in the early phase of this next wave, and I'm super excited about it. And maybe this is another webinar, but now I'm going to throw you a buzzword mashup in there. So, they call it AIoT. So you're combining AI and IoT. But I have a real hard example of that, of, this process, because I would go to these IoT conferences and then, they talk about the smart refrigerator, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, your milk is almost done, and then it automatically orders you some milk. Ah, great. That's a nice story. But now actually, there's a company in Switzerland called Axino, and they really do have AIoT. So there's a sensor in the refrigeration unit of large retailers.
Yeah.
And then that speaks back to an algorithm that'll tell you the core food temperature, which is really the important part for compliance and for food waste and to optimize your refrigeration.
Yeah.
So, just as an example, a mid-size food retailer in the US, their budget for refrigeration and energy is about 80 million a year. So if you can use these devices, and AI together and reduce their cost by 4 or 5%, that's significant. Wow. So those are the kind of workloads you're seeing. And yeah, I think it's pushing the compute really to the edge. So you have, what's the name of that company? Mythic AI. So they're designing AI chips, which is basically, it has compute and network and storage all in a processor chip. So I think, as much as, we've seen the compute power in these things advance, well, it's a mobile phone. My background blurred that.
That'll get better as with technology as well.
The cloud, yeah. You can't see it, but it's there. Yeah, so I think we're really on the next wave of there in robotics, agriculture, and it's combining the algorithms plus the devices plus the cloud infrastructure.
Yeah,
So Yeah.
And it reminds me, I give my age away a bit here, but it definitely reminds me of the .com era, where you had like things, something called Gopher and FTP. And
Yeah.
then eventually the first web page came out and we're like, whoa. And if you
Yeah.
look at it now, it looks like primitive stuff.
Exactly.
And the idea that you could just like go on to some, web page and order your groceries was absurd. I mean, companies went bankrupt over that. And now it's possible.
Exactly.
I feel like we're in that phase now with a lot of these.
Yeah, and it's moved from just tinkering and putting stuff together, and it works some of the times to, okay, here I have a product that can roll out at scale.
Yeah.
And then gaming is, they're literally pushing the edge on this in terms of performance, high frequency traders, so there's a lot of applications at scale that really need that local compute.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really, it's an amazing space. Patrick, have you seen some companies working on this, doing things, especially with the data center, the data, the compute on the edge, things like that? What are you seeing?
No, not really on the edge. I've seen a lot of companies, or actually edge computing was interesting because a lot of companies ask like the data locality, right? So that's where edge computing can also actually address some of the concerns, for sure. No, not edge.
That's basically where data must be or must not be in a certain country.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you see that in Europe, sort of companies sort of looking for that type of, where edge was first designed for like IoT to reduce these like latency issues.
Yeah.
You're now looking for edge to actually put that data in the country instead of in the scary cloud, right?
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know I've run into like really interesting things, like countries like Turkey, for instance, have a very strict law. Data cannot leave Turkey for any reason, which makes it tricky because I don't know of any AWS data center in Turkey. So yeah, I mean, maybe I might be out of date on that now, but yeah, that's a great one. So great. Well, in the interest of time, what I do want to ask you guys both, I'll start with you, Patrick. Are there any interesting technologies or companies that you've seen that we should keep our eye out on, and some areas that we might do a deep dive on in a future session?
Well, you mentioned security, right, as a cool topic. So probably one of the companies that's very, very innovative is like IMVision. So I'm working partly with them, IMVision, and they are focusing on the API security aspect. And the interesting stuff is that because there's a lot of API security companies out there, but they actually use natural language processing to understand API consumer and provider behavior, right? To really understand the dialogue between the front end and the back end. So that's a very interesting company.
Yeah, so basically, as people are using more, SaaS apps, they're rather than connecting to servers, they're using APIs, and that's of course growing and growing. And sounds like what InVision is doing is focusing on the actual, like almost the behavior and the what's being said rather than the technical protocols and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, understand the application behavior, the user behavior, and putting that all together, and then sort of detecting flaws in the system. Yeah,
that's great. Jonathan, anything you've seen that's interesting? You mentioned a few, I think Helios and a few others. You have anything interesting we should keep our eye out for?
Yeah, on the theme of edge, there's a company called Edge Impulse, and they have embedded machine learning that you can run on devices. So it'll make devices much smarter. And it goes to, so you can mirror your machine learning models and push those down to actual devices like robotics, cars, other things that need to have that learning local.
Wow.
I think they're really helping, define some standards and, give like container-like portability to these workloads.
Yeah, I think that's just going to be a big area. You mentioned refrigerators, but the devices just get smaller and more higher in numbers.
Exactly. And, you look what happened with the mobile phone. If you extend that out to other devices, you'll have mini computers in almost everything at some point.
Yeah, and that's a good analogy, because one of the other things that I've experienced in working with these is when you go to especially a large customer and you talk about a new technology, it reminds me of, I was that person when somebody said to me 20 years ago, you could have a computer on your phone.
Yeah.
I was like, why would I want that? That's stupid.
Exactly.
I think we're working in those spaces where that's a very common conversation we're having.
Yeah, now you're like, when was the last time you made a call on this thing?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
So, you can actually talk to people on those.
Yeah, amazing. And you use an app for that, actually.
Yeah.
Great. So this has been fantastic. A great conversation. I really look forward to setting up some future conversations with both of you guys, and hopefully many more topics as well. So as closing, what I will do is, first of all, thanks everybody for attending. any questions, any comments, any suggestions, please get in contact with us. It's our general email address at CloudNativeX. We're also on Twitter, of course, and we have a nice LinkedIn page where we publicize all the different webinars and things we're doing. We work also with the partner vendors that I mentioned. We also do events for them, which go very specifically into their specific technologies. Of course, we also have our CloudNativeX website, which is where we compile this information. You can go there and learn about all the different partners. We're posting content. We're doing interviews and videos with the innovators, founders, technical experts. So I think it's a great site. And what I would definitely recommend doing is going to the site and signing up for the CloudNativeX newsletter, which is at most once a month. You know, we try to get them out once a month. Sometimes it's actually a little less, so you won't get spammed. That's what's important. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing everybody again at an upcoming CNX Forum. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.